E é uma satisfação ter o Ernst aqui, já é a terceira vez que ele vem aqui. Né? E a primeira foi uma aventura, que nós fizemos aqui no PPG, né? E contamos inclusive com a disposição do próprio Ernst de bancar parte das passagens, né, para poder conseguir ter aqui. E, pelo visto, parece que foi muito bom, porque já é a terceira vez que ele está aqui presente e é uma alegria para nós termos aqui. Então, o professor Ernst, ele vai fazer a palestra, ele vai fazer em 5 minutos uma apresentação para vocês, né? E o Cláudio vai traduzir isso, e em seguida ele vai fazer o resto da conferência dele em inglês, e aí, em sequência, a gente abre para as perguntas e vamos virando aqui na questão da tradução. Ok? O professor Ernst.
Obrigado. Buenas tardes todas e todos. Há 10 anos, quando ainda trabalhava na África do Sul, vim pela primeira vez a Teresina. Helder de Carvalho convidou-me para uma conferência sobre anciões. Há 2 anos, voltei para fazer uma apresentação sobre Ricoeur. No ano passado, editei uma edição especial da Pensamento com Cristina Viana e Amélie Cassi. É com grande alegria que continuo esta relação com o vosso departamento de filosofia. A Rede Ricoeur e aos organizadores da Conferência que me convidaram, muito obrigado. Desculpe, ainda não sei falar português. Por favor, tolérez-me o inglês. Donc, ce qui s'est fait, c'est qu'on s'est rendu compte qu'il y avait moins d'anglophonie que prévu. Donc, ce que je vais faire, c'est de raconter la blague très vite en français, comme ça vous pouvez rire, et ensuite je peux raconter de manière plus prosaïque tout en anglais, et vous pouvez ou bien suivre la traduction portugaise ou bien vous endormir comme vous voulez. Il s'agit dans... Ah oui, tu veux.
Ele diz como ele se deu conta que existem aqui menos falantes, né, de inglês que de espanhol, de francês. Ele decidiu então contar a piada rapidamente em francês, né, e depois e eu vou fazer, né, essa tradução, e depois vai ser projetado o texto aqui. Ele vai falar em inglês, e quem quiser dormir pode dormir.
Dans cette intervention, il s'agit du rapport entre Henrique Dussel et Paul Ricoeur. Il y a 2 ans, quand j'ai fait ma présentation, j'ai présenté une première partie de mes recherches sur cette relation. Toute cette recherche vise à faire une chose, c'est de nous débarrasser des obstacles à un bon dialogue entre une philosophie de la libération telle que celle de Dussel et une philosophie, la philosophie sociale politique chez Ricoeur.
Tudo que eu tento fazer, na verdade, é tirar os obstáculos, né, entre esse debate entre o Henrique Dussel e o Paul Ricoeur, né, relacionado a essa dimensão de uma política social, uma política socialiste.
Ouais. Donc, comme vous le savez, Ricoeur et Dussel se sont rencontrés en 1991 pour un dialogue qui était, à mon avis, complètement échoué. Échoué du côté de Ricoeur parce qu'il ne s'est pas rendu compte de l'importance de l'événement, il n'a à peine fait une contribution intéressante. Échoué du côté de Dussel parce qu'il a fait une lecture très personnelle et créative dans le mauvais sens de l'œuvre de Ricoeur. Il a notamment déplié l'œuvre ricoeurienne de tout ce qui est intéressant do point de vue politique.
Ele disse que houve encontro entre o Ricoeur e o Dussel em 1991, mas que acabou não funcionando, né? Não dando certo, né? Sendo interessante tanto do ponto de vista do próprio Ricoeur como do próprio Dussel, né? E que o Dussel tentou tratar justamente dos pontos da obra do Ricoeur do ponto de vista político.
Donc ce que je voudrais faire aujourd'hui, c'est de trouver une manière de relancer le dialogue. Je voudrais commencer tout à fait ailleurs, sur un point où ni Ricoeur ni Dussel avaient anticipé un dialogue. Je prends comme point de départ, point d'orientation, un livre de Dussel de 2006, 20 thèses sur la politique.
Então, o que eu vou tentar fazer é reiniciar esse debate entre os dois, né? Mas sem levar em conta aquilo que já foi feito, aquilo que não deu certo, partindo de uma obra do Dussel que é de 2006.
En 2006.
2006.
Je vais tout simplement lire le livre thèse par thèse. Je vais faire des découvertes très intéressantes. Première, c'est que entre Ricoeur et Dussel, il n'y a pas de grande différence par rapport aux grands traits de leur pensée politique.
Então, eu começo a ler essa obra capítulo a capítulo, por mostrar que não há tentar mostrar que não há grandes diferenças entre Ricoeur e Dussel, sobretudo do ponto de vista político.
Ensuite, je vous présente, ça je peux vous démontrer en regardant les thèses numéro 1 à 5 de son livre.
Quoi
1 à 5. Des thèses 6 à 10 nous donnent un aperçu de la structure de leur argument. Je vais vous montrer que les deux auteurs s'orientent par un triangle de concepts: action, institution, norme et norme.
Vocês vão poder perceber no texto, né? Primeiro eu vou falar do primeiro ao quinto capítulo, depois eu falo do sexto ao 10, ao décimo, para mostrar que há uma certa relação, considerando o conceito de ação, de instituição e de norme.
Ouais. Alors, j'aurais fini la première moitié du livre de Dussel et la comparaison montrait juste des grandes similarités. Et je me dis que ça, c'est pas intéressant. It's not fun anymore. Donc, ce que je vais faire dans la deuxième partie de mon exposition, c'est que je vais voir si je peux poser une question dusselienne à Ricoeur, à savoir qu'est-ce que la philosophie politique peut dire à propos et en faveur des pauvres.
E depois, então, ele vai tentar colocar uma questão a partir do próprio Dussel, ao Ricoeur, o que a filosofia do Ricoeur pode fazer para os pobres, em benefício dos pobres.
Les éléments de mon exposition seraient d'abord une démonstration que la thématique des pauvres est bel et bien présente chez Ricoeur. Je voudrais vous dire ce que ça veut dire. Et ensuite, des points suivants, je vais parler de l'altérité, des capacités, de l'idéologie et utopie, le paradoxe politique et la critique.
Bom, então eu vou tentar mostrar que existe efetivamente no Ricoeur uma maneira de pensar essa questão dos pobres. Depois eu vou falar sobre o conceito de alteridade, capacidade,
ideologia
e utopia, e, enfim,
le paradoxe politique,
o paradoxo político
et critique.
E crítico, né?
Et voilà, c'est ça que je vais faire maintenant. Bonne nuit ou bonne lecture selon votre choix.
Então, é isso que eu vou fazer agora. Uma boa noite para vocês ou uma boa leitura para quem vai ler.
Merci pour votre attention. In April 1991, the Argentinian-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel and the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur met in Naples. The aim of the meeting was to discuss the relation between hermeneutics and the philosophy of liberation. Dussel's and Ricoeur's contribution are published in Dussel's book, The Underside of Modernity.
Pardon, Andrés, j'ai oublié de te dire, je fais exactement ce que tu as voulu éviter, qu'on lit un papier comme ça, mais désormais, tu peux bien t'endormir et lire le texte plus tard.
In 2023, I presented a reading of this encounter in Campinas and Teresina. I argued that Dussel's reading of Ricoeur is slanted and contains various gaps. It can really not serve as a basis for connecting the two philosophers. Most notably, Dussel overlooked Ricoeur's decolonial thinking, his philosophy of history, and generally his political philosophy. In the Naples encounter, Ricoeur bizarrely hardly evoked any of this, thus squandering a very valuable opportunity to demonstrate the political significance of his work, which he had always sought. I concluded that this was a failed debate for both participants and also for those of us who tried to learn from them. If we want to set up a productive confrontation of their work today, we need at least an intersection of their concerns. I'm looking for this vantage point in their political philosophy. In an effort to keep this comparison manageable, I will start out from Dussel's 20 theses on politics. By contrast, it is well known that Ricoeur never rounded off his political philosophy into a single monograph. I will use the seminal essay, The Political Paradox, and oneself as another, and then refer to other parts of his work as becomes necessary. Last comment before I start. I am an academic, and I'm fascinated by authors and their ideas and their histories. But I'm also a citizen of the world, first of all, and in this capacity, my readings are motivated by my outrage at the state of normalized destruction of human lives that could have been mine. The title of my paper, Philosophy Against the Unjustifiable, refers to this outrage. The political and politics. Dussel's book consists of 20 theses. The first 10 theses are an outline of his core convictions in political philosophy. In theses 11 to 20, he then reconsiders this view by emphasizing the place of the victims of political power in it. Dussel starts his introduction with the following words. In order to understand the political as a concept and politics, it is necessary to spend some time analyzing the essential moments. From the almost uncountable ways in which Dussel could have started his political philosophy, he does it with a distinction between the political and politics. This distinction is the core structuring element of Ricoeur's political thought, as you all know. In 1957, he writes, for instance, from the political to politics, we move from the advent to events, from sovereignty to the sovereign, from the state to government, from historical reason to power. Thus, for both authors, there arises in human societies a potential thrust towards collective pursuits and the real-life actualization of that potential in political action. The political and politics refer, as we'll see, to potentia and potestas, to popular sovereignty and collective or institutionalized power. How do our two authors flesh out the significance of this distinction? Firstly, they all accord the political and politics a descriptive function, both with an extremely ambitious anthropological stretch. Ricoeur sees the troubled relation between the political and politics unfolding throughout human history. Dussel is even more ambitious in claiming that the development of this relationship describes the architectonic moments, the minimum necessary and sufficient conditions of all possible political orders. But for both authors, the political is decisive for the whole theory in being not only its descriptive core, but also its normative reference point. The political refers, for both philosophers, to the principle of popular sovereignty. For both authors, our critique of any society is derived from this point of reference. For Dussel, the corruption of politics is an infringement of popular sovereignty. Likewise, for Ricoeur, there is something like political evil because the legitimate collective pursuit of a good life can be distorted. The point of departure for both theories is thus an understanding of popular sovereignty and the doings of people who either enact that sovereignty or erode it. For Ricoeur, the relation between the political and politics is as important as the distinction itself. He qualifies this relation as a paradox. This means that political power is the occasion for the biggest evil because it is the instrument of historical reason of a people. Dussel does not use the word paradox, but it captures the way he unfolds the relationship between the political and politics throughout his book. For both authors, the term political serves to see everything political throughout society as distinct from other aspects of social reality. Neither author thinks in terms of watertight separations between different aspects of social life, but the point is that the political and the economic, to name but these, follow different logics and the one cannot be reduced to the other. Finally, neither author aims at defending a specific political family. In fact, Dussel is unambiguous in striving to formulate a new theory. But both authors engage in debate with existing theoretical offerings in such a way that they embrace neither liberalism nor dogmatic socialism. Let us now look at the main elements of the political. Since Dussel strives to anchor his thinking in the fate of vulnerable people, he initially calls the political thrust the will to live, people striving for survival. However, he broadens his point by claiming that politics as consensual and feasible will to live should attempt through all means to allow all members of society to live well, and to increase the quality of their lives. Accordingly, he defines politics as an activity that organizes and promotes the production, reproduction, and enhancement of the lives of members of that community. As such, politics could also be referred to as the exercise of the general will, notably in its most radical and precise sense as offered by Rousseau. Interestingly, Ricoeur also understands the aim and meaning of the political teleologically. It is a collective action directed at the realization of the good life, following Aristotle. But this requires that each citizen assumes an internal posture, virtually signing a contract with all others to act in view of the general will as theorized by Rousseau. As in Dussel, Ricoeur knows that such commonality of pursuits requires practical discursive reason. Dussel elaborates this will to live together to a threefold structure which traverses his whole book. We'll come back to that several times. So the political has a material moment, which is the will to live and live well, a moment of legitimacy, which is required to bind people together in non-coercive ways, and a moment of feasibility, which is the question of the means by which people are to undertake their pursuits and the trade-off between the material and legitimacy requirements. Ricoeur does not present such a clear schema, but all three moments are important structuring elements of his own view of the political. The material moment is present in his idea of the collective pursuit of the good life. This defines the political individual as belonging to a political whole and thereby participating in collective power. The legitimacy moment is born from the legitimacy of striving for a good life, as it is for Dussel. However, this powerful collective thrust to the good life is also requires some limitation for the sake of safeguarding popular sovereignty and individual lives against the abuse of power by institutions. And finally, the feasibility moment, which is less clearly presented in Ricoeur's thought. However, only by means of powerful institutions can the people make their collective aspirations feasible, according to Ricoeur. Ricoeur derives his understanding of the state as instrument of the collective will from Max Weber, who also underscored that steering the power of the state requires responsibility, of which he identified a central trait, namely Augenmaß, that is, a sense of proportion or sound judgment, the capacity to assess correctly the circumstances. Likewise, Ricoeur's entire political philosophy is shot through with the concern of finding practicable solutions to conflicting claims within the specific events of each context of action. We'll see below that he later calls this phronesis or prudence. You know that obviously. To be true, the material legitimacy and feasibility moments of public intersubjectivity are, for Dussel, not always given, but is initially a potential to be actualized. He explicitly draws from Spinoza's distinction between a potential of power, potentia, and institutionalized power as potestas. A similar figure is at work in Ricoeur's analysis. The political exists often as a virtual agreement between people, which means that people subscribe implicitly to it, or when compelled by circumstances, they may discover the will to pursue the general will emerging again in them. When subsequently they obey laws, the supposed understanding is that these laws are their self-imposed laws, with all of the hypocrisy that in reality needs to be exposed. The reasonable collective will has to give itself effect by taking decisions. The political goes nowhere without politics. Now one can better understand Dussel's general view on the political. I cite Dussel, I will therefore use the term potentia to refer to the power that is a faculty or capacity inherent in the people as the final instance of sovereignty, authority, governability, and the political. This power, as potentia, constitutes the foundation and essence of all that is political. The political then is clearly descriptive, but also normative. It is normative in that it references the will to live, which is indisputably good, in the rationality and justifiability of pursuing this aim collectively and realistically, and by rejecting the limitation of people's power by domination, coercion, or violence. Ricoeur would have said nothing different. From this real potential of power, we now need to turn to the realization of power. From the political to politics, from potentia to potestas, from instituting power to instituted power. For Dussel, this means that institutions and representatives have to give effect to the material, legitimacy, and feasibility qualities of people's power. Again, Ricoeur would not have said anything different. And as we have seen, the unavoidable and necessary actualization of power in action and institutions is fundamentally ambiguous, as Dussel would have said, or paradoxical, as Ricoeur says. In this way, for both Dussel and Ricoeur, the exercise of political power is always considered from the perspective of the political. This is partially necessitated by descriptive precision. Throughout history, protests and contestations of power have emerged in the name of what is due to the people. But with this backing of real-life claims to the validity of the interests of the people comes the normative thrust of the argument. This normative orientation is explicitly or implicitly appealed to when the abuse of power is exposed. For Dussel, this is the reference point in terms of which to distinguish between obedient power and fetishized power. Ricoeur highlights a history of opposition to the abuse of power, stretching from the prophets of ancient Israel and Plato to Marx, Lenin, and the Khrushchev report. Each time, in a new context, the basic principle is articulated. If the state is not representative of people's humanity, then political evil is not serious. The point is that there is political evil only in terms of political rationality. In other words, each time we critique the abuse of political power, we presuppose the normative standard of political sovereignty. Whatever the form of statehood, it should be assessed, critiqued, and corrected with reference to the normative core, which is the political. This whole trajectory, everything I've discussed thus far, based on thesis 1 to 5 of Dussel's book, outlines the basic components of Dussel's political thought. But these are also the basic elements of Ricoeur's political thought. We are not dealing with curious, occasional, or unrelated overlaps, but with fundamental agreements. It is not an agreement in vague general terms like commitment to democracy or justice, but an agreement about the most important points of orientation in political philosophy. The question is then, if that is the case, what can the one philosopher still learn from the other? What is there still to debate about? Let me try to add some spice to the discussion. In his book, Dussel refers twice to Ricoeur. In thesis 1, Dussel insists that social actors traverse the field of politics, which is an uneven force field of different power dynamics, and then adds, this field, the political field, is not merely a text to be read, as Ricoeur would argue, nor it is a symbol to be decoded or an imaginary to be interpreted, since they equally exist set actions with specific purposes, which are then repeated in institutions and structured through consensus, alliances, and enmities. These fields then are practical structures of the power of will, as well as narratives to be understood through intersubjective practical reason. That is Dussel. Have we finally found a point of substantial disagreement? Well, not really. A Ricoeur who would have spent his philosophical efforts to construct an account of the field of politics as actually just a text to be read, that Ricoeur is a fiction of Dussel's imagination. More interesting is to note what Dussel briefly presents in the citation as the alternative vision. Acting in the political field has to account for the teleological dimension of action, the constitution of social institutions through various social interactions, fields as hybrids of narrative and power, all to be approached in practice through intersubjective practical reason. One finds all of these theorized by Ricoeur, for instance, in his volume From Text to Action. My point is that the apparent disagreement about action in social fields really is none. Rather, what we get from comparing Dussel and the real Ricoeur is two attempts to examine politics as action situated in the complexity of social reality. In fact, when Dussel moves on to the actualization of the political from thesis 6 onwards, he immediately links up with the theme of action. Political action is contingent, uncertain, has to be exercised within force fields of power differentials, and can be rendered more efficient either by strategy or recourse to means and by acting in agreement with others. In short, Dussel says, this strategic action requires the faculty of practical reason, which the ancients called prudence or phronesis. When Ricoeur drafted Oneself as Another, he made the bulk of it an examination of the complexities of varying human capabilities to act. This examination culminates in the kind of intelligence Ricoeur identifies as typical of action, namely phronesis or practical wisdom. For this reason, when I now examine some of the core moments of Dussel's thesis 6 to 10, I will mostly use Oneself as Another as source of Ricoeur's view. This book that Ricoeur qualifies as a contribution to practical philosophy and which deals principally with human action. So I move on to strategic action, institutions, and normative principles. In thesis 6 to 10, second half of part 1, Dussel outlines the basic structure of politics, in other words, the collective action which rises up from potentia to realize potestas. That schema comes from Dussel's own book. That is his schema, just add the arrow. So that schema consists of A, that is strategic action or phronesis, B, which is action which is exercised in institutions, it's the second level, and which are oriented by normative principles, that's level C. Institutions and normative principles are each divided in 3 spheres, as you could see, which we have already encountered in rudimentary form: the material, the legitimacy, and feasibility in both cases. Okay, that is the structure of Dussel's argument. Let us compare his general framework with Ricoeur's framework of action in Oneself as Another. The schema that follows there is not Ricoeur's, it is mine. I hope you recognize it from, as an outline of Oneself as Another, except for thesis, study number 10. In this book, Ricoeur studies action in general, according to 4 analogous dimensions. Action which is speech or saying, action proper, doing, narrating, and imputation, that is, appropriating one's actions in terms of normative judgments. So I read from top to bottom. These actions are coordinated in no pre-established way, but they depend rather on each on a context of action, and of which one can speak in different ways. One can speak about actions in different ways, describing them, narrating, or assessing them. The agent in question can be both an individual or a collective. Ricoeur studies action as starting out in a capability of agents, I can, we can, which remains only a potential until these capabilities are realized in interaction with others, never without some institutional mediation. This is a very general theory of social interaction, but everything applies to politics, and politics is explicitly thematized in the ethico-normative studies 7 to 9, which culminates in reflections on responsibility and phronesis. The structure of Ricoeur's book is not that of Dussel's book. However, substantial overlaps between the two models are patent. The centrality of action, the tension between potential and practical realization, the significance of institutional mediation, the normative orientation of action, and the conflict between different normative claims, striving for the good life, legitimacy, and feasibility, which, last point, requires prudential judgment. Time does not allow me to run you through the comparison of oneself as another and Dussel's thesis 6 to 10. Allow me just to read my conclusions. The two authors model their overall argument differently. However, this does not have a significant impact on the substantial overlap in content. Dussel borrows the theory of hegemony from Gramsci, which is not found in Ricoeur. This is a key component of Dussel's comparatively more sophisticated view on the sociological constitution of political protest movements, something for which I don't see an equivalent at least in oneself as another. Both Dussel and Ricoeur understand that feasibility is a constitutive demand of political action, and both concur that this demand has to be met with practical wisdom or phronesis. However, Dussel generally develops the feasibility aspect of politics in more detail than Ricoeur does, and assigns the political function of feasibility to specific institutions. For Ricoeur, the question of practical trade-offs, phronesis, and by implication all questions of feasibility is an integral part of social interactions in all institutions. Fourth point, both authors adopt a normative view on politics. Dussel accords priority to a deontological view. Ricoeur accords the priority to the teleological view, but for both authors, these two normative views, as well as the tension between them, are essential to their view of normativity in politics. Fifth point, Ricoeur's understanding of normativity in politics is more conflictual than in Dussel. For Ricoeur, this is not just a question of correctly theorizing political normativity, rather the theoretically irresolvable normative conflicts serve as motive to push us from theory to practice. Political agents are obliged to decide in action what remains in theory undecidable. Having said this, I still think that Dussel's view is not incompatible with this aspect of Ricoeur's thought. In short, it is possible to profile the ways in which Dussel and Ricoeur build forth from the common basis, which I have analyzed with Dussel's thesis 1 to 5. But even so, the most salient findings of this comparison between oneself as another and thesis 6 to 10 of Dussel's book is a confirmation of substantial correspondence, not merely of individual points, but also in the internal logic and coherence of the theoretical offering as a whole. So, since that is the case, I want to make this a little bit more interesting. I'm going to change the direction of my presentation. First, I will merely explain what Dussel does in part 2 of his book, the second half of his argument. Then I turn to Ricoeur and ask what he has to offer in order to fulfill this function that is present in Dussel's thinking. So, what we will be speaking about is the same political philosophy discussed thus far, but now considered from the perspective of the excluded, the victims, and the poor, formula from Dussel. In passing from part 1 to part 2 of his book, Dussel shifts his perspective within the people as anchor of political sovereignty, from the total citizenry the starting point of part 1, to those who need to be differentiated from this whole on the basis of their fate as victims of diverse oppressions. They are the excluded, the victims, and the poor. In other words, part 1 may form the foundation of Dussels' political philosophy, but part 2 represents what it is ultimately directed at. The victimhood of this fragmented segment of society is defined in terms of violence against the constitutive moments of their being the people. Here comes Dussels' own words. They are victims because they cannot live fully the material moment, because they have been excluded from participating in decisions that harm them, form moment of illegitimacy, and because they manifest in their own suffering and unsophisticated demands the ineffectiveness of the system, at least with respect to these victimized groups. That's a political philosophy of victimhood, or at least a political philosophical definition of victimhood. Focusing on the victims entails for Dussel to double his theory of potentia and potestas and the principles of politics that ensue from it. Accordingly, like the political community can find a practical consensus to form a potentia, so the victims of politics can form a critical consensus, which Dussel calls a hyperpotentia for resistance. For the rest, hyperpotentia is structurally exactly the same as potentia. It comprises of a material moment of the will to live well, a moment of legitimacy, which is drawn from a critical consensus about the state of affairs and the need to struggle, and a moment of feasibility of liberation. I now want to put Dussels' concern for the excluded, the victims and the poor, to Ricoeur as a question. Given his substantial agreement with Dussel about political philosophy generally, what could Ricoeur contribute to a political philosophy in the service of this concern for the excluded, the victims and the poor? Let us start by recalling the last words of Dussels' response, Ricoeur's response to Dussel in Naples in 1991. It's just taken from his text. I, Ricoeur, readily concede that these figures of alterity, he speaks about figures of alterity in his own philosophy, and these figures of the other are summed up and culminate in the moment of otherness, where the other is the poor. This is where I, Ricoeur, meet and listen to the philosophies and theologies of liberation. Just a pity he doesn't develop it. That's the end of the presentation. Nothing more. So my first question is, how serious should one take Ricoeur when he records such a significant place to the poor in his own thought? The poor is a culmination of all figures of alterity in Ricoeur's own thought. That's my first question. One can find a response to this question in two essays specifically devoted to poverty. Ricoeur unambiguously sets the tone in Que signifie la présence des pauvres parmi nous, 1961. Poverty then is not a symbol to be contemplated, it is a form of evil to be eradicated, he writes. He knows that poverty is not a mere mishap, but a structural feature of contemporary societies. Poverty rather presents the tragic aspect of historical development, he writes, and he has no illusions about the core of the problem. The biggest factory of poor people in history is capitalism. Likewise, 30 years later, in L'exclusion est une violence, Ricoeur considers how the major structures of social inclusion do not only produce inequalities, but function at the expense of violent social, political, and economic exclusions, inequality and exclusion. The theories of social integration that Ricoeur likes to cite very often, Rawls, Walser, Boltanski, and Thevenot, insufficiently theorize exclusion. According to him, it's not me, it's Ricoeur who says this. Thus, the question is how to think of human dignity and the human rights of those who do not participate in any significant way in the networks by which to claim such rights. Finally, Ricoeur argues extreme poverty thus marks the exclusion from the most liberal system of inclusion. It constitutes violence through the denial of human rights, a lasting violation of the entire spectrum of human rights. If then Ricoeur's concern for the poor and excluded is beyond doubt, my question is, what can someone who shares Brussels' concern for the victims of politics learn from Ricoeur? And I've chosen 5 points. J'avoue que ce sont des points un peu arbitraires. Ce que j'ai essayé de faire, c'est d'oublier un peu que j'ai écrit un livre sur le jeune Ricoeur où il parle beaucoup de la décolonisation et tout ça. J'ai essayé de m'appuyer seulement sur ses pensées à partir des années 70 et surtout autant que possible des morceaux de sa philosophie très connue. The first point is about poverty, exclusion, and alterity. We saw in the citation, Ricoeur speaking to Dussel 1991, that according to Ricoeur, if we want to gain a grasp on poverty, we need to connect it to the concept of alterity as found in his work. When Ricoeur introduces the category of alterity in his response to Dussel, his perspective is not metaphysical but ethical. This means that to understand the poor as other, we need to start out from the descriptive, normative idea of the will to live together, popular sovereignty, or the political. However, knowing the political paradox, knowing that collective pursuits generate not only beneficial but also harmful effects, we have to look at exactly the same reality of popular sovereignty, starting out from those that are excluded from it. Our collective politics fails not only when we don't succeed to pull off ambitious projects, but also in as far as our collective projects generates poor and excluded people and thus harm the popular sovereignty which legitimates our endeavors. This is why the victims of the system tell us as much about the political as the collective striving for aims does. It is thus a logical necessity of this view on political society that alterity should be both the best and the worst of social life. Alterity is the best in the sense that reciprocal identification with others constitutes a political community. It is the worst in the sense that asymmetrical exclusion of others undermines the legitimacy of this collective action. Let us just focus on this last point, the negative side, and ask, where do we find this alterity? How is it registered? Who is it? Ricoeur's response is, we find it in embodied experiences. First of all, those of really hungry, destitute, fatigued, and maltreated others. And in the call of moral conscience, when we see and hear about the fate of the exploited, excluded, and abused people. That I draw from study 10 from Gonsalves note. We encounter them in personal relations, when we see social inequalities, vulnerability, and precarity of people around us, homeless, beggars, and so on. And institutionally mediated relations to others, of which we may take note through journalism or social scientific studies about oppression, discrimination, or exploitation. As long as we seek a political philosophy that is descriptive and normative, as Dussel and Ricoeur do, we need sociological and normative theories of the successful exercise of popular sovereignty, and of the excluded other of the exercise of political power. This brings me to the second point about capabilities and incapabilities. By turning to capabilities, we do not leave Dussel behind. In fact, we can read in 20 theses on politics, progress is not measured quantitatively by GDP, with mercantile measurements in dollars, but rather by the subjective satisfaction of capabilities. To use Amartya Sen's term, which requires a new civilizational paradigm politically governed by the demands of production, reproduction, and development of human life, that is, ecologically, economically, and culturally. Although Dussel doesn't develop his point in these terms, the citation reveals that he is expressing the core of his ethics of the good life in terms of the increase of capabilities. Ricoeur's contribution to a philosophy of capabilities is therefore valuable for two reasons. First, because his positive description of capabilities is a tool for describing social interaction. Second, because this positive description can be flipped around to serve as a heuristic of failed or impaired capabilities of the condition of being poor or excluded in the broad sense that Dussel and Ricoeur have in mind. In short, while the political pursuit of the good life requires the reciprocal and collective exercise of capabilities, suffering can be defined in terms of the reduction or destruction of people's power to act. In sense terms, poverty is capability deprivation. Andres is already an answer to that. That is my approach to poverty. Poverty is capability deprivation. For this approach to work, the descriptive category of capabilities has to double as a normative orientation. Ricoeur explicitly affirms this when he anchors the normative side of his theory of capabilities in the idea that it is good to be able to act. It follows logically from this orientation that any undue violence to human flourishing through the social activation of capabilities should be suspected of being harmful or unjust. Inasmuch as Ricoeur's normative orientation is anthropological, we may consider a theory of the hampering of capabilities a theory of alienation. It's very interesting if you read Ricoeur at the end of the 1960s. Wow, vous ne comprenez pas, n'est-ce pas? Si on lit Ricoeur à la fin des années 60, début 70, c'est incroyable de voir combien de fois il pense bien utiliser le terme aliénation. Bon, c'est pour ça que je me suis autorisé d'introduire le terme ici. And if it is correct that political legitimacy is derived from collective potentia, from people's capability to act politically together, then a theory of the obstructions to the capability to act together is a theory of injustice. This double vision on capability as necessary but prone to injury corresponds with Ricoeur's view on normativity as consisting in the coordination of two simultaneously valid but conflicting claims, an affirmation and a negation, a yes and a no. In this case, yes, it is good to pursue the good life with and for others in just institutions. No, it is not good that this valid pursuit has a side effect of damaging some people's capabilities intentionally or unintentionally. So let me illustrate my point with a number of randomly selected examples. I map a series of decapabilizations on Ricoeur's grid of action. That is why I again printed the schema there. Starting at the level of the capabilities of the agent, I or we are deprived of speaking. We can be deprived of speaking, for instance, by being relatively deprived of education in the means by which to articulate one's grievances in specific contexts. Or doing, for instance, by not having at one's disposal sufficient means to be able to exercise significant choices of one's life in a meaningful way. Or you can be decapabilized on the level of narrating, for instance, by being the subject of socially dominant discriminatory narratives. Or in imputing, for instance, by not being able to develop the self-esteem required to participate in meaningful assessments of social events. Likewise, the activation or deactivation of people's capabilities in relation to others in direct presence, the you, covers the entire range of actions. One can be impaired in speaking, for instance, by being reduced to silence or being subject to verbal abuse. Doing, by reduction of the capabilities through neglect or physical violence. Narrating, by being unrightfully omitted from accounts of praise. And imputing, by being the victim of unfair judgment, hearings and sentencing. Finally, the institutional mediation, the IT, has its impact on people's capabilities. One may be obstructed in speaking through the marginalization of forms of discourse and expression in public fora. Doing, through systematic exploitation of categories of labor and maintaining a large section of societies in joblessness. Narrating, through symbolic violence by essentializing role attribution. Think of homophobia, ethnocentrism, racism, etc. And imputation, for instance, by overburdening some people with responsibility for the social fate they suffer. Here, I have mostly taken individual agents as examples for decapabilization, but the whole exercise could be repeated for organized collective aid action and its decapabilization. And just as one could trace people's increasing inability to defend themselves against the loss of capability, so one could use the same grid to document efficient deployment of individual and organized capabilities to inflict violence, exploitation, repression, and humiliation on others. Similarly, the whole grid of actions could be used to examine the remaining capabilities of agents as they mobilize to resist oppression. Point 3. The linguistic mediation in terms of which we critique. It is striking that Dussel's turn to the concrete, as he says himself in part 2 of his book, is infused with very unconcrete elements: imagination, postulates, utopia, etc. Without offering any explicit account of this, Dussel introduces a whole pack of non-material elements of meaning into the core of his own philosophy of resistance to injustice. Aspects of Ricoeur's philosophy can help us to gain a grasp on some of this. Ricoeur always understood how action is traversed by meaning and language. I want to highlight only those that are specifically relevant to the social fiber, to that which binds social participants together or keep them apart. In short, what he calls social imaginary. Under social imaginary, Ricoeur understands two kinds of linguistic and symbolic webs. He calls the first one ideology, as if you didn't know that. Ideology includes all kinds of social ties, economic, cultural, linguistic, political, etc. He also recognizes people's ability to invent counterfactual representations of social relationships, utopias, in ways that question or contest the existing status quo. Both ideology and utopia are forms of social imaginary. Social in the sense of configuring social relationships and interaction, imaginary in the sense that it could have been otherwise and is not simply material. Both ideology and utopia are undeniably part of social reality, but both are fundamentally ambiguous. Both contain most constructive and most harmful effects. For Ricoeur, ideology and utopia are not just one thing, but three. The first kind of ideology we have already seen, that is ideology as integration. In a myriad of ways, people buy into existing webs of social founding meanings. As such, these ties have a de facto normative authority. The question is if the institutions of authority, not only the state, but also institutions of family, education, science, and whatever, can successfully claim adherence from a sufficient number of people. This is the question of ideology as legitimation. The fact is that exercising authority always requires more buy-in from the population than is immediately available. People need to create an additional energy of acceptance to fill the authority deficit. The social function of ideology legitimation is to circulate views by which to generate this creation of additional legitimacy from the people. Again, one should not too hastily cry foul, since positive reforms, those that increase protection of the vulnerable, also require such use of ideology. Ricoeur understands very well that authority may involve the distortion of social reality, that ideology legitimation may mobilize distorted views on the institutional authority, or that ideology integration itself may already contain hypocritical views on the social good. He refers to this as ideology distortion. It is not an ideology that floats above social reality as a superstructure, but one that infiltrates the heart of the social reality of integrating imagination, such that some people are coerced into living with a circulation of social meanings, as for instance in racism, and legitimating argumentation where institutional violence is paternalistically paraded as care for the greater good. The source of critical questioning is already present in social imagination in the form of utopia. Ricoeur even claims that to each of the three versions of ideology corresponds a version of utopia. Roger Savage briefly presents the three functions of utopia as explorations of the possible in respect of ideology integration, contestation of modes of ideology justification, and escape from ideology distortion. I readily grant that Ricoeur does not present us here with a simple tool. In fact, these threefold categories of ideology and utopia serve as first sensitization for the diverse manifestations of social imaginary as they traverse concrete social reality. But this leaves us with a very difficult task of interpreting the specifics of the societies we are concerned with. Fourth point, the political paradox between self-realization and alienation. So I now want to turn to the practical agenda of any philosophy that places the poor and excluded in its center, and that is liberation. What could any liberation-driven philosopher learn from Ricoeur? One part of the response has already been given. If one wants to reflect upon liberation, a good starting point would be to ask what one needs to be liberated from. And I've argued that Ricoeur's later anthropology could help as a sensitizing means to get a full grasp of this. Now one could complement this negative approach by considering a positive approach. What did Ricoeur have in mind when he spoke about freedom or liberty? One could use his anthropology to articulate a plural view of liberty. It would consist of the formation and maintenance of basic capabilities and the possibility to exercise such capabilities in social interaction. In addition, we also have to consider the practices, political initiatives by which to make the first two possible at all. Philosophers can engage with the theme of liberty on different registers. The metaphysical and linguistic registers do not concern us here, but the practical philosophical register does. Let me just outline this basic distinction. The first form is an internal or solipsistic or abstract freedom, the capacity to say yes or no, independent of the reality in which I find myself. It is the freedom of judgment. There's nothing to be objected to this notion of freedom. Indeed, it is even required for the political meaning of freedom. However, if it is elevated to the single most important figure of freedom, it becomes ideological because it cannot deal with the real life conditions under which freedom has to be realized. Note in advance that this ideological critique is part of Ricoeur's refusal of liberalism, which does not ask about the conditions of being free collectively, but only assures a bubble of freedom from a state's intervention, and that what he is doing in effect is to deconstruct a hypothesized freedom which is reduced to the freedom of choice. To access the real notion, political notion of freedom, one has to open the singular internal sphere of subjective freedom and enter the world in which the potentially free individual is merely one among many others. This advances an understanding of freedom as intersubjective, that is, in the terminology used above, freedom has its reality only between a self and a personal or impersonal other. This is freedom that depends on mutual recognition in institutions. I don't use that expression for nothing. The similarities with Axel Honneth's philosophy is very striking. Or to say the same thing otherwise, this socio-political freedom has to be thought within a context made of power relations, of influence of some over others, of violence of all sorts, of constraints by conditions we often didn't create, and within a state that transcends us. It is indeed the task of political philosophy to think through this paradox. Political philosophy, Ricoeur says, is entirely dominated by this paradox. Power is both the condition of collective existence and one of the great alienations of history. However, the role of philosophy is limited to clarification and sensitization, which is to say that it is important, but that it falls short of what the paradox demands, namely arbitration in practice. To summarize, any politics that is sensitized to the fate of the poor and excluded can proceed with the ambition of liberation only by entering the force field of the paradox of political power. While Ricoeur does not spend much time to develop this point, it follows logically from his view that this negotiation of the political paradox in practice holds on all levels, from the inchoative grassroots level to such initiatives that strive for a different globalization. What I call negotiation of the political paradox should not at all evoke a simplistic vision of peaceful collective problem solving. For Ricoeur, political action starts out from the recognition of conflict. I cite Ricoeur, "I am saying that only those who have theoretically and practically recognized the irreducibly polemical and conflictual nature of the exercise of power are armed against the pathology that is grafted onto this conflictual structure. The decision-making nature of politics is such, with its attendant coercion, force and violence, seems to me to be an inescapable feature of political action as such. All social conflicts are situated within the field of tension of the political paradox. Ever since its first formulation, Ricoeur points towards a critique of any present arrangement of this paradox and the status quo of power. In other words, while he spends much of his effort to reactivate the collective yes as motive for politics. He never separates us from disagreement, disapproval, indignation, exposure, critique, in short, from no. This brings us back to the question of the poor and the excluded from which I started. The no draws the position of unfair inequality and exclusion from the social mechanisms of redistribution into the center of our attention. And its reach is not limited by the frontiers by which institutions exclude some. My fifth point is shorter. One doesn't need to be a political theorist to register injustice, but philosophy and social sciences may help to gain a more informed and encompassing view of what is going wrong in society, why there are such gaping inequalities, and why some people are excluded from the distribution of participation. One such instrument is regressive inquiry, Rückfrage. It is a mode of thinking by which to analyze and question the composition of established social entities or modes of organization. Regressive inquiry is a discipline of looking at social arrangements, laws, institutions, states, companies, and why not, races, social merits, status, normality, standards of beauty, etc., entities and arrangements that may be taken for granted in the everyday social existence, but from the perspective of their progressive constitution from interaction. This means not only that the present societal given is deprived of its obviousness and its continuity reconstituted, it also means that the variety of kinds of interaction through which they arose, ranging from most mutual to the most asymmetrical, could come into view again. This does not mean that each and every instituting interaction can be retraced, but that the kind of interactions implied by the existence and endurance of institutions can be reconstructed. The result is not to deny the real-life concreteness or sturdiness of institutions, but to give us a critical tool by which to identify the fragility of those institutions we need to protect and start to view the real mode of existence of those we critique. This critique consists of identifying the kind of interaction and the quality of action that different role players are able to contribute to the constitution of these social entities. Thereby, we trace the genesis of the meaning of these institutions. Again, not to deny in any way their materiality, but giving us something to hold on to as we critique how institutions walk real life. This work of regressive inquiry is clearly more than an intellectual exercise. Oriented to the fate of the poor and excluded other, it can be inserted into a practical philosophy in which an understanding of the fragile constitution of organizations, movements, institutions, arrangements are as much part of the status quo that has to be opposed as of the collective initiatives by which to act to the benefit of the poor and the excluded. Those who are asleep can now start waking up. I am at the conclusion. I started this paper by demonstrating the very substantial agreement between Wiesel and Ricoeur on political philosophy. Then I've taken Wiesel's insistence on theorizing political philosophy a second time, this time most adamantly with the fate of the poor and excluded in mind. Finally, I presented 5 aspects of Ricoeur's later philosophy which could easily be put to the service of Wiesel's agenda. This does not settle the question of the relation between these two great philosophers. However, I hope to have demonstrated that the reconstruction of the discussion between them, which never really took place, is not only possible, but that it holds the promise of enrichment for those of us who have inherited their work. Obrigado.
Thank you very much for this brilliant conference. And now it's time to perguntar a vocês. Nós estamos avançado um pouco no tempo, né? Nós temos pelo menos uma rodada de perguntas. Mais alguém?
Boa noite.
Bonne nuit.
Vou fazer a pergunta em português.
Je vais poser la question en portugais.
É muito interessante a reconstrução
Très intéressant la
pela
reconstruction
via do político,
pour la voie du politique.
esse debate
Ce
entre
débat
Ricoeur
entre Ricoeur et
e
Dussel.
Dussel. Mas uma coisa que eu fiquei me perguntando,
Je me posais la
à
question
luz de algumas coisas que já foram faladas aqui,
des questions qui ont déjà été
inclusive
discutées ici.
a questão antes levantada
La
pelo
question
Wolff,
qui a été
se
posée
Ricoeur
hier, si Ricoeur,
responde a esses problemas ou não.
s'il donne une réponse
E
à
uma das coisas
ce type de problème ou pas.
que Ricoeur coloca por exemplo, a maior fábrica de pobres é o capitalismo.
La plus grande
Hoje já saiu muita coisa sobre o capitalismo.
industrie des pauvres, c'est le capitalisme. Les fabriques.
Algo que eu senti falta na reconstituição política a respeito
Je pense qu'il a manqué de
do
la
Dussel
reconstruction
e do
politique
próprio debate do
par
Ricoeur
rapport
com Dussel,
à Dussel et le propre
é o
débat entre Dussel et
retorno a
Ricoeur,
Marx,
c'est le retour
que Dussel
à
faz
Marx,
deliberadamente,
que
e de Marx bem específico,
il a
filosófico
fait de manière délibérée.
e etc. A minha questão
Ma question, c'est
e a resposta tanto de Dussel quanto de Appel na
la
época,
réponse de
esse foi
Dussel
um dos
et
problemas
d'Appel.
do desacordo, foi de dizer, bom, é cara que está voltando ao leninismo e tal. Por outro lado, Ricoeur toma Marx
il essaie
que
de retourner le
teórico hermenêutico da suspeita.
Ricoeur, c'est un philosophe de l'herméneutique de la suspect.
Também, na luta pelo reconhecimento,
Aussi, un parcours de la reconnaissance,
tem certo momento
il y a un moment
que o Ricoeur afirma
il a dit
que a luta pelo
la
reconhecimento
lutte pour la reconnaissance,
a produção de riqueza
c'est la production de la richesse.
diretamente proporcional à produção de desigualdade.
La production de la richesse, c'est proportionné à la production des inégalités.
Quanto mais se produz riqueza, mais se produz pobreza.
Donc on produit des richesses, on produit de
eu e o
pauvreté.
Cláudio traduzimos esse texto, a gente ficou
À cette époque,
perguntando que saída Ricoeur
Claudio
e como que
et moi,
Ricoeur
on a
vai
traduit
por
ce
esse
texte.
lado. Hoje,
Aujourd'hui,
a minha questão à luz desse debate com
ma
Dussel
question,
é justamente
à partir de ce débat avec Dussel,
tanto Dussel, tanto Appel quanto Ricoeur acreditam
et
na
même
reforma.
Ricoeur,
Na reforma,
je crois dans la réforme,
talvez protestante à luz de Rede,
peut-être
mas na
protestant
reforma
à la
do
lumière
capitalismo. Enquanto
du
Dussel,
protestantisme,
a posição dele é
mais Dussel,
tanto a respeito de Hegel quanto de Marx da revolução.
Dussel pense à partir de Hegel, mais aussi de Marx,
Como é que
à propos
você
de la
vê esse
révolution.
problema?
Comment vous pensez sur ce problème?
Obrigado.
Elle a fait référence, je traduis comme parcours de la reconnaissance, mais c'est notre texte. Il fait référence à la lutte pour la reconnaissance. C'est l'article plus petit de 2004 qui a été publié par l'UNESCO.
Okay.
La lutte pour la reconnaissance de l'économie du don.
Alguém mais quer fazer logo uma segunda pergunta?
Tu vas parler français?
Oui, je pense que...
Oui, c'est mieux.
Thank you very much for the question. I really appreciate it. It gives me, first of all, the opportunity to make very clear what I'm doing here. Merci beaucoup pour la question. Ça me donne tout d'abord la possibilité de dire très clairement ce que j'ai fait ici. C'est quel genre de performance universitaire que j'ai essayé de démontrer ici. Tu vois,
résumer à la fin. Ok, très bien. Si un Ricoeurien, c'est quelqu'un qui pense que Ricoeur a une réponse à tout, alors je ne suis pas Ricoeurien. Le but de ces recherches que j'ai fait ici, c'est pas de démontrer que, en fin de compte, il y a une réponse pour tout chez Ricoeur, mais de mettre son œuvre à l'épreuve pour voir comment il peut m'aider à réfléchir. Il y a un très beau texte de Bachir Diagne, philosophe sénégalais, où il dit que je lis les autres auteurs pour savoir ce que moi je pense.
Ele disse que se um riqueriano pensa que Ricoeur tem resposta para tudo, ele não é um riqueriano. Então, ele vai ao Ricoeur buscando maneiras de problematizar, de pensar. E ele faz menção a um autor, você pede como é? Diagne, que disse que eu leio outros autores para ler a mim mesmo. Je lis d'autres auteurs pour lire moi-même, n'est-ce pas?
Je lis les autres auteurs pour savoir ce que je pense moi-même.
Eu leio outros autores para saber o que eu penso eu mesmo, o que eu mesmo penso.
Donc, je prends Ricoeur très au sérieux parce que j'ai déjà appris des choses, mais je ne suis pas du tout ici comme disciple de Ricoeur qui le défend contre Dussel ou que ça ne m'intéresse pas du tout.
Eu levo o Ricoeur muito a sério, leio ele de maneira muito cuidadosa, mas eu não sigo ele, né, exatamente como uma maneira de dar uma resposta ao Russell.
Les questions que Dussel pose par rapport à notre vocation en tant que philosophe politique sont mes questions. Il me convainc, il me parle et je mets ces questions-là devant les pieds de Ricoeur et je lui demande qu'est-ce que tu peux m'aider à penser.
Eu pego então as questões que são colocadas pelo Dussel, né, e levo ao Ricoeur e, de uma maneira, busco saber o que Ricoeur tem para dizer sobre isso.
Quand on parle de la pauvreté, ce problème, ce phénomène, a évidemment un côté économique. Je peux demander à Ricoeur des questions économiques, mais il ne va pas me donner de grandes réponses glorieuses. Il a fait des contributions, il y a quelques textes sur l'économie, il y a son entretien avec Michel Rocard. Si tu veux en savoir plus, Pierre-Olivier Monteil a écrit un beau livre, Ricoeur politique, dans lequel il a développé surtout une pensée ricoeurienne en rapport avec l'économie. Donc ça peut se faire.
A questão da pobreza é uma questão econômica, mas se nós levamos essa questão, né, ao Ricoeur, ou buscamos no Ricoeur uma certa dimensão econômica, isso não vai ser encontrado. A gente poderia até citar ou mencionar uma obra Ricoeur político, que é uma obra do Pierre-Olivier Monteil.
Quand ils avaient leur débat à Naples, un grand point de critique que Dussel avait adressé à Ricoeur, c'était que vous n'avez pas de philosophie économique. Or, dans le livre The Underside of Modernity, dans la préface, je pense, Dussel dit qu'il avait rencontré un an précédent Ricoeur quelque part aux États-Unis, ils avaient discuté et Ricoeur lui avait dit « Oui, c'est vrai que je n'ai pas une philosophie économique, mais je n'ai pas la compétence. »
Quando houve o debate em 1991 em Nápoles, o Dussel disse ao Ricoeur que ele não tinha uma filosofia econômica, né? E eles se encontraram um ano antes e o Dussel colocou essa questão novamente ao Ricoeur, mas ele disse, não, eu não tenho competência para discutir, para tratar disso.
Je pense donc qu'on peut aller regarder ce que Ricoeur a écrit sur l'économie, peut-être qu'on trouve des choses intéressantes, mais quant à moi, je commencerai ailleurs. Ricoeur n'est pas un auteur de référence pour moi en économie. D'ailleurs, je ne comprends pas plus à l'économie que lui.
nós poderíamos até o Ricoeur buscar essa dimensão econômica, mas para mim isso não diz muita coisa, assim como também não dizia muita coisa para ele.
La dernière question, c'était par rapport à réforme et révolution. Dans ce texte que j'ai cité à la fin ici sur le conflit que Ricoeur a écrit dans les années 70, il dit « Ne me posez pas la question sur réforme ou révolution, la situation va nous dire, mais c'est sûr qu'il pense toujours généralement en termes de réforme. » Dussel, dans les 20 thèses sur la politique, dit précisément la même chose. Il essaye de faire un genre d'acte d'équilibrisme, mais il dit quelque chose que j'ai trouvé très important, c'est que c'est pas en décidant qu'on va faire une révolution qu'on peut réaliser une révolution. Dussel est assez perspicace dans sa critique d'une certaine vision, je dirais, moderniste sur les révolutions, selon laquelle le fibre social est quelque chose qu'on peut juste traiter comme on veut. On peut décider, un jour on va faire une révolution, on le fait, et voilà, sans prendre suffisamment en compte les conditions qui doivent être rassemblées pour qu'une révolution ait lieu. Et c'est pour ça que Dussel, dans ce livre-là, est un peu hésitant. Il hésite vraiment pour dire explicitement qu'il faut aller vers la révolution. Il développe plutôt une théorie de réforme critique, réforme accélérée ou quelque chose comme ça, une tentative d'équilibrisme entre les deux positions.
De maneira resumida. Ele disse que ele tem razão em levantar a questão sobre a reforma, sobre a revolução, mas o próprio Ricoeur disse, não me coloque essa questão. Mesmo se, sim, nós podemos perceber que há no próprio Ricoeur um tratamento, ou aparece essa questão da revolução. E o próprio Dussel, ele tenta mais ou menos se equilibrar ao tratar dessa questão da revolução, mas ele diz que ela pode ser feita, on peut faire la révolution, mais...
On ne peut pas tout simplement faire une révolution par un acte de volonté.
Nós não podemos simplesmente fazer uma revolução a partir de um ato de vontade, né? Isso o Dussel teria dito.
Dernier petit commentaire, Dussel a passé une énorme partie de sa vie en étudiant Marx. Je pense que 15 ans, il n'a fait quasiment que ça. C'est très admirable, mais il a arrêté grosso modo en 90, 91 dans ces eaux-là. Quand on regarde le livre Les 20 thèses sur la politique et on se demande alors Dussel, qu'est-ce que tu as appris de Marx que tu penses qu'il faut mettre dans une pensée politique, la réponse est très très peu.
Dussel estudou Marx mais ou menos por uns 15 anos e em 1990, 1991, 80,
de 95 à peu près à
1995
à peu près.
Que
90.
Até 1900. Não.
80.
Meu Deus do céu, fatigue.
75 à 90.
1975 a 1995. 80 quand? Oui?
90.
Perdão, 1975 a 1990. Ele estudou Marx e depois ele deixou isso de lado.
Pouco poderia fazer. Pouco poderia fazer.
E pouco poderia fazer com isso, né? Com a obra do Marx. Obrigado.
Any question? If not, let's finish. Thank you, Ernst. Obrigado, Cláudio, pela tradução e obrigado aí pela resistência.